2.
Okay, I think we can start. Welcome all to this interdisciplinary lecture series of neuroepigenetics. Today we are happy to be joined by Anna Stenning, who will talk about decolonizing psychology through the humanities. My name is Leni van Goitsenhoven and I will facilitate today's lecture. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Neuroepigenetics project, about which I will say something in a few minutes. First, let's take a look at the program of today. After this brief introduction, we will, of course, listen to Anna. Then we have a few respondents. Each response will be around 10 minutes, and after that, there is an open Q&A. First, in a moment, Anna's handout will be shared in the chat. It's a Word document with quotes she will use also in her presentation. And you can download it by clicking on the file in the chat. May I ask you to keep your microphones off while Anna is talking? You can also choose whether or not to switch on your cameras. This talk is, like the others, recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So please keep your camera off if you do not want it to be recorded, of course. If you have questions for Anna, you can signal this in the chat by writing down the question or just raise your hand during the Q&A. May I also ask, when you raise a question, to write down that question in the chat and read it out loud or send it to me. Then Anna is more sure that she will understand the question that is asked. A few words on neuroepigenetics, so the host of this interdisciplinary lecture. It's an ERC-funded research project led by Professor Christine Hens. It's a project that investigates how persons with various neurodevelopmental conditions, such as autistic persons, but also persons with Tourette or ADHD, their families and the general public experience the interaction between their condition and their biological and social environment. This summer, we started with a series of virtual interdisciplinary lectures, and we aim to host lectures by a variety of researchers who are working on issues that relate to our project or sub-projects. And our first guest lecture in this series was by Eva Jablonka on cultural epigenetics. We also had an afternoon on philosophical perspectives on neurodiversity, and Rachel Rosen and Judith Swissa introduced perspectives from philosophy of education and childhood studies and asked the question, to whom does the future belong? The lecture of today proposes the need to consider why the project of decolonizing the future should extend to consider barriers to being posed by Western psychology. And Anna will focus on different ways of experiencing time and space as they manifest in autobiographical narratives by authors who identify as autistic. Anna proposes that both imperialist discourse and contemporary psychology invoke time as linear progress that defies the reality of our dynamic material and cultural circumstances, including those of our differential embodiments. The talk, her talk, which is part of a bigger project, explores multiple meanings of autism, demonstrates how three texts, literary texts, disrupts dominant conceptions of autistic subjectivity, defined as deviations from chrono-normative life stages. So when hearing this, there are already quite some connections to be made with the neuroepigenetics project, of course. Various of our team members work, for instance, with crib time, to rethink linearity in the concept of developmental disorders, but also the multiple meaning of autism and autobiographical narratives are studied in my own work as well in Christine Hen's work. To introduce you to Anna, Anna Stenning is a literary and disability studies scholar at the University of Leeds. Her postdoctoral research interests include nature writing, life writing, global disability studies, autism, psychology, environmental fiction, narrative studies, and the 19th and early 20th century British and American literature. She teaches courses in literature and creative writing, and her current research focuses on literary representation of autism and the intersections between disability studies and environmental justice. She's also the co-author of Neurodiversity Studies, a New Critical Paradigm. So Anna, thanks a lot for being here with us today. I think we can start now with the lecture.
Lenny, is everybody else hearing this? No.
Autism,
I think,
is a developmental disorder.
Anna, everyone hears you, I think.
I know it's going, I think you have to unmic, Lenny, for it to hear you.
Anna, sorry?
I think when you have your mic muted, the sound isn't broadcast.
Okay, that's true. Sorry.
That's okay. Sorry, I know this is a bit different to usual.
In this talk, I propose you to consider why decolonizing the future should include a consideration of barriers to being posed by Western psychology. I focus here on different ways of experiencing time and space as they manifest in autobiographical narratives by authors who identify as autistic. I propose that both imperialistic discourse and contemporary psychology invoke time as linear progress that defies the reality of our dynamic material and cultural circumstances, including those of differential neurocognitive embodiment. I introduce clinical discussions about autism as a developmental disorder characterized by various temporal misdemeanours, including inappropriate repetition and delayed or absent responses to social cues. This talk, which is part of a bigger project exploring the multiple meanings of autism, it aims to demonstrate how two recent memoirs by autistic authors disrupt dominant conceptions of autistic subjectivity, defined as deviation from chrono-normative life stages. The implied authors offer spatially inflected narratives of time where repetition, reflection, and reconnection structure their emergent stories of meaning, belonging, and sociality. Narrating autism is therefore not the project of recovering authentic accounts of autistic experience, but reconfiguring received understandings in different circumstances. These autobiographical works, in turn, show the dominance of a reductive, cognitive psychological idea of selfhood in Western literary criticism. And this talk is part of a broader body of work that offers a literary historical approach to representations of autism, and it looks at how various institutions, including psychology, have situated it as a condition of departures from normative behaviours in the fields of communication and social behaviour. While I do not doubt that there are biological bases for conditions known as autism and other forms of neurocognitive difference, I'm interested in critiquing the way in which these are situated within cultural narratives about what it is to be human. I argue that these narratives focus on overlapping ideas of developing, flourishing, communicating, personhood, and socializing, which can be explored via the construction of autism, where autism figures as a synonym for deviancy in these areas. And like other psychological disorders, autism can also be seen for how it contributes to the production of a normal, correctly functioning, and ethically valuable human being. Yet also, autistic authors can show, the writings of autistic authors can be explored in terms of how this gives voice to new forms of subjectivity that aren't recognised within existing cultural scripts. I propose this in terms of Karen Barrad's idea of meeting the universe halfway, of the agential cut, which demonstrates how discursive structures around autism interact with the apparatuses of equipment, of experimentation in the production of the object that is autism. So I'm presenting these ideas while my work is still in progress, and I would like to focus today on a selection of cultural and clinical texts that situate autism in relation to time and selfhood, in the hope to make my theoretical approach clearer. I will also describe my hermeneutical methodology, which I hope offers an ethically informed approach to interpreting text by and about minority subjects. And this is a very tentative decolonial approach, given that the theorists I'm drawing on are Western critics of Western psychology. And as I've continued my research, I've started to consider that contemporary psychology in the UK and America, although often practiced by well-meaning individuals and organisations, reinforces restrictive ideas about what it means to be a person that are both anthropocentric and invested in eugenic ideas about collective human becoming. While I've come to this work with ideas from new materialism, I also believe that those working in Indigenous studies have valuable insights into an agential ontology that extends beyond the human. However, my current work focuses on ideas gleaned from cross-cultural psychology about how Western ideas of independent self-waste dominate our current practices in psychology. And also, I've taken some ideas from philosophical psychology, which critiques the focus on cognition and which has been used so much that it excludes common sense understandings of what it means to be a person. As a helpful intermediary at this stage, I will also refer to work by the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who has sought to breach the rupture between our everyday lives and the work we do as researchers, which has, within anthropology, manifested as a focus on ethnography with reproducible methods rather than attentive observation. As Ingold explored in his essay, That's Enough About Ethnography, anthropological practices that are based on transcendence of a subject beyond their material presence in an encounter transforms the object of their study into something inanimate and lifeless. The same can be said about researchers who write retrospectively about experiential accounts from autistic individuals without paying attention to either the text production, the ongoing role in the development of other people's knowledge and being, the fact that it is a product of a flesh and blood author, and their own situation in the subsequent analysis. As Ingold explains, there can be no observation without participation, that is, without an intimate coupling in perception and action of observer. Thus, participant observation is absolutely not an undercover technique for gathering intelligence on people on the pretext of learning from them. It is rather a fulfillment in both letter and deed of what we owe to the world for our development and formation. So in this sense, although I'm very aware of my position in this research, as an autism researcher, I feel that this has become less important than I thought it would do. And I'm actually increasingly interested in the conversation about what it means to be human. However, as a result of my experiences, I've also been particularly interested in how the autobiographical accounts illuminate experiences that I've also faced, and which I've also read in the context of disability studies. These include ideas about barriers to being and barriers to doing that occur as a result of finding oneself unable to conform to socio-cultural expectations about what it means to be human. Since this is based on my own interest in trying to make sense of the text, I'd be particularly grateful for your own observations on these readings. To end the brief introduction to my talk, I will talk a little bit about the two texts I'm going to go on to discuss in more detail later on, and the themes that I'm going to be looking at. So the Indian-American author Tito Mukhopadhyay's memoir, Plankton Dreams, from 2020, narrates the author's experiences of special education in the US. This education had consisted mostly of efforts to prevent temporal indiscretions, such as standing up at the wrong time, writing too much or too little within a period, and refusing to pay attention to activities designed for someone much younger. In the world beyond the text, Mukhopadhyay had already written and published 2 memoirs by the age of 10, and those are pictured on those slides. It's Beyond the Silence and the Mind Tree. And in these, he explored his diagnosis of autism, his mother's teaching of a wide curricula, including literature and science, his apraxia, and his unusual sensory experiences. Through the later work, Plankton Dreams, the narrator writes as an adult, and in it he gives us a retrospective satire of his earlier years, focusing on, in equal part, on repetitive punishments, behavioural misdemeanours, and what happened when he allowed his mind to wander. And the second text I'll discuss is the British author Katherine May's recent memoir, Wintering, which is pictured on the left, which is the power of rest and retreat in difficult times. In it, we have a narrator who is more culturally privileged than Mukhopadhyay, but she is struggling to perform her work as an academic and as a mum due to illness and the effects of masking her autism for the sake of producing an acceptable social self. She tells that this experience, while painful, of wintering, has offered her an opportunity to embrace experiential knowledge of the realities of suffering. Although the book does not talk at length about autism, the earlier work, The Electricity of Every Living Thing, depicted on the right in the slides, from 2018, explores adult autism diagnosis. And while the authors of these texts might be thought of as outliers to the typical manifestations of autism, because Mukhopadhyay is non-speaking, highly intelligent, and has severe apraxia, and Katherine May is verbally articulate and able to pass as neurotypical. But their works share a focus on what can be learned from experiences of being neurodivergent. The 2 texts indicate the wider development of memoir by openly autistic authors, which do not necessarily focus on autism, which is assumed to have a relatively stable referent as a condition of sensory and cognitive difference. Instead, they present experiences in the light of a framework that includes autism, but also extending into ideas about time and place. I think this is particularly important because, as Jack Martin and others have explored, our interpretations of our experiences, including those that align with medical frameworks, seldom conform to a single genre. And going back to the themes that I'm talking about in this presentation, I've chosen to focus on time and self, because these are particularly troubled by and help to unsettle dominant representations of autistic subjectivity. Ideas of time, delay, and change are so often present in both clinical accounts of generalized autism and in individual narratives. And as they do so, they suggest quite different ideas about what it means to be a self or a person. The dominant framework is that there is an atomistic, static, and essential self who can be identified with their brain at any moment in time. And I would argue that this is the way that clinicians and narrative theorists influenced by cognitive psychology have sought to read life narratives by autistic authors. This idea of selfhood, which supposedly makes the self knowable, although not to the subject themselves, effectively reduces all psychological phenomenon to neurobiological, genetic, or cognitive correlates, and has no room for individual context, intentionality, or becoming. I believe that this is the case even when the theorist situates their work within deconstructionism, which questions the extent to which there can be a unified human subject. These readings may simultaneously displace the subject to cultural formations and discourses, at the same time as suggesting that autism is, through the absence of introspective awareness, a condition that could never be defined through cultural formations. So I'd like to introduce an alternative idea of personhood, which I think is a middle ground position between deconstruction and a reductive materialism, which sees personhood as emergent upon complex biophysical and socio-cultural factors. And this does not entail that everything that is relevant to our personhood should be immediately apparent to us, but it indicates that what we are as persons is dependent on dynamic socio-cultural contexts. And in the words of Jack Martin, human persons are social animals born into our familial, social, cultural, and moral commitments and relations. Our interpretations of our experiences within these contexts are an important part of what we ordinarily speak of when we refer to ourselves as persons. And it is in this context that we exercise agency and creativity. I'm quoting Martin, "Studying the lives of persons requires expanding psychologists' traditional and methodological toolbox to include various forms of life writing, description, and theorizing, so that we explore phenomena rather than reproducing methods that have served us in the past. The aspects of our personhood that we may narrate, however, will be shaped by our interactions with others. An emerging self-narrative is therefore dynamic, mutable, non-essentialistic, relational, and interactional. This approach to self-narration is supported by one approach in narrative ethics. When we write about our lives, we reinterpret recollected experiences in the effort to reveal some interesting aspect of our personhood through the context of our ongoing concerns and frameworks. This means that we are not seeking to offer a direct transcription of our experiences, but instead to reveal subjective truths about what life is like for us. If autobiography is thought of as a direct transcription of experiences by a static, individual, and independent self, it cannot express the development of self through time with all its material, relational, and social complexity. And while this may lead a reader to decide that the very idea of self or personhood is an illusion based on a mythical desire for order over chaos, one alternative can preserve the sense that there is something that remains me through time, even if it cannot be reduced to a single idea. And this is the idea that there is such a thing as a narrative identity. And it seems to be particularly important for authors whose subjectivity has been diminished by totalizing narratives from epidemiology or cultural stereotypes, and it is particularly important for those from culturally oppressed groups, as John Greisman has observed. To take works by autistic authors as rhetorical products, we will need to situate ourselves within the intended audience. And to do so, we need to attend to the author's efforts at interpreting their experiences and then subsequently reinterpreting them into a narrative. Our assumptions about autism may preclude us from situating ourselves in the narrative audience. And in this case, we will overwrite their interpretations of their experiences, and we do not subsequently allow them to speak to us as persons in a fuller sense. While it is true that when we read any work of purported non-fiction, our readings will always be informed by preconceptions, but a more ethical approach may be to postpone the process of coming to conclusions as we connect together new ways of understanding the world. Hannah Meritoka has explained that when we approach a text with this in mind, narrative unsettles our cognitive and affective categories, and it is in this manner that something ethically valuable can happen. Recognizing ostensibly factual narratives as themselves based on subjective interpretations of events rather than a direct transcription of experiences may paradoxically allow us to develop new conceptual schemes as we take on board the implied author's vision. One of the roles that an author may assign to the narrator in memoir or autobiography is offering interpretations and evaluations of events and experiences. This may be particularly tricky when an implied author's experiences will trouble a reader's sense of the proper way of going about living a life. In one anonymous review of Katherine May's book Wintering, The Power of Retreat and Rest in Difficult Times, the reviewer finds themselves frustrated that the author has not gone back to their job within what they consider a reasonable time frame. And I quote, "Self-care does not need to be done in conjunction with deception and fraud, but the lack of self-awareness and introspection for a book that was supposed to be about that may be rather miserable. She seems to have met some wonderful people, yet learned nothing. Perhaps this is because of her self-confessed Asperger's or autism. But the lack of empathy, hypochondria, and narcissism on display make this a pointless and difficult book to read." Simply put, this reviewer thinks that the author should accept medical advice and move on, instead of indulging in what they consider hypochondria and narcissism. And despite the fact the book is labelled as a mental health biography, it is taken by several of the more critical readers as purporting to be a self-help book. To other readers, and I would say this isn't exclusive to those who identify as autistic, the book offers a sense of solidarity and a way of finding meaning from more difficult experiences. As an autistic woman dealing with burnout, I found it immensely validating. It provides a pragmatic and calmly logical counterpoint to society's prevailing obsession with linking a person's worth to how visibly busy and productive they are. If I take one lesson from this fascinating and deeply researched book, it is that I need to pay attention to what is happening in my body and mind, not what I am told should be happening. And I should match my strategies to the season I am in, just as we do in order to cope with the actual weather conditions. The difference in the reviewers' responses to the book seems to be whether they're willing to value the process of slow reading, a digressive and reflective work that doesn't offer any solutions. In the context of a culture that values individually achievable enlightenment and resilience over critique and rebellion, readers may be looking to find replicable solutions that allow them to progress towards life goals. And the idea of life as a progress towards a series of predefined goals is implicit in some of the ideas that psychology employs in relation to time and in the model of selfhood that it uses. And in Time Binds, Queer Temporalities, Queer Histories by Elizabeth Freeman, the author describes the emergence during the 19th century in Europe of chrono-normativity, which is the use of time to organize individual human bodies towards maximum productivity. Freeman looked at cultural works such as films and novels, which offered a way to unbind time from history through their presentation of embodied queer practices that troubled normative time. Freeman distinguished these works from those that show normative temporal gestures and patterns of organizing chronological time. And she connected this to Dana Luciana's work on cultural orchestrations of emotion. Freeman describes chronobiopolitics as practices that shape our familial and collective forms of belonging. These strategies for living shape everything from family meals to national events, weddings and funerals, and supply authorized versions of movement and change towards national goals. From the perspective of the state, this sequence of socio-economically productive moments is what it means to have a life. The authorized timelines and rhythms privilege certain forms of embodiment that are seen as more natural. And in this way, time becomes both an embodied practice in affective and affect and gestural processes, and it can be seen within this framework as essential to the production of bodies that seem proper. This idea of time as enabling progress in economic and material terms has become, through further operations within psychiatry, medicine, and law, the idea that anything outside of this structure is destructive of the people's collective inheritance. While Freeman's argument is directed at those rendered other by chrononormativity due to their sexuality or gender, I will go on to consider how chrononormativity can be understood in hegemonic representations of autism. And if we see time as the most scarce resource, we may also obstruct other ways. We may obstruct a consideration of how our assumptions about space-time can have negative impacts on other peoples and places they inhabit. For instance, our collective focus on speed through personal transport has led to slow violence in those places where oil extraction goes unnoticed. Equally, those with atypical forms of embodiment may find themselves excluded from spaces due to their organization towards maximal efficiency for a majority of subjects. A different sense of time exists within narratives of autism, and while this discourse, in which contemporary cognitive models of autism exist, is ostensibly about the potential inclusion of autistic subjects and the shared progress towards development goals for a population, the implicit target of such interventions is the overarching goal of ensuring more valuable subjects achieve their role in a reproductive future. And the idea that autism entails a pathological time, relationship to time, is implicit in early psychological models of autism. In the early 1940s, Leo Kanner described autistic children as repetitive and ritualistic. And this influenced what Jake Klein has come to describe as the widespread mistreatment regime of applied behavioral analysis, or ABA, which paradoxically includes a repetition of tasks for up to 40 hours a week. I could argue that this can be seen as an instance of what Pine calls temporal misdemeanours, in which an atypically embodied person fails to conform to the structures of a normative culture. The WHO's ICD-10 is the most widely used diagnostic manual for autism, and it conceives of the condition as a pathological development disorder, which produces not only abnormalities in reciprocal social interactions and in patterns of communication, but also restricted, stereotyped, repetitive repertoires of interests and activities. One recent paper has even considered the fact that the key deficit in autism might be the inability to perceive time. More recent cognitive models of autism, including those that position it as both mind-blindness and weak central coherence, also connect autism to temporally inappropriate behaviours that obstruct correct social interaction. The idea of autism as a developmental disorder suggests that it is essentially difficult for the individual who is unable to attain life's essential milestones. However, this is typically reinterpreted through cultural scripts that suggest that autism is mostly a problem for those surrounding autistics, since their lives are more natural or valuable. In this framing, not only do the parents and siblings lose out on reciprocal social contact with their child, but they will find their efforts to live a more normal life disrupted. These framings of autism also reinforce a concept of an independent self that dominates within Western culture, which obstructs recognition for those who understand themselves differently, either through different cultural contexts or also possibly through neurocognitive differences. While the dominant diagnostic manuals for autism and related conditions were sought to be neutral with regards to culture, they actually effectively reinforce a Western ideal of human flourishing. And within the field of cultural psychology, Shinobu Kitayama and Hazel Marcus have described individual selfways as offering an atomistic understanding of the person as an inherently free agent abstracted from context. These representations emphasize and reinforce promotion-focused motivational tendencies to express authentic preferences and to pursue opportunities for expansive personal growth. They suggest the need to exert control over one's surroundings and to seek out higher arousal positive affect states. Independent selfways afford analytic, cognitive, and perceptual tendencies to focus attention on defining attributes of objects independent of their background as the primary objective of reality. Independent selfways also seek to explain everyday events with an emphasis on personal dispositions and understanding reality in terms of abstract rules. Independent selfways afford growth-orientated relational tendencies to perform social support and care as verbally oriented emotional intimacy, and to construct love as romantic pursuit of fulfillment via intimate connection. Alternatives to independent self-control can be found outside of a Western perspective, and these consider self in relation to forces external to the bodily person, including in their family, society, and in their sense of ethics. In this talk, I propose the need to consider why decolonizing the future should include a consideration.
Anna, is it?
Oh, hello.
Yeah.
Sorry.
The video stops.
Okay. I think, could I just have a second to find out why that's happened?
Yes, I think so. And otherwise, can you pick in, or is that difficult?
Oh no, I can definitely kick in. So would you be able to enable my screen sharing?
Yeah.
Would you be able to remind me which slide I was up to? I think.
No, further.
Obviously, it happened just as I had to remove my cat from the room because he was starting to attack my computer. So I actually missed where the video stopped.
It was on slide 9, I think, where independent self ways.
Thank you very much. So, from current slide. So while autism is often assumed to be an essentially independent way of being, the condition does not necessarily involve being the right kind of independent that is valued by Western culture. And it is often framed as a state of radical independence and removal from social life. Yet the narratives from the perspective of autistic writers do not necessarily coincide with this. And yet, because modern psychology is often premised upon individualistic concepts of personhood aligned with independent selves, does not account for how behavioural traits, even those that are seen as inherently autistic, are dependent on social context. And this is in itself can prevent autistic inclusion. And so insofar as the diagnostic manuals consider autistic subjectivity, it may be inferred as a kind of a thin sort of existence marked by unintended gestures and sounds, and either behavioural modifications are made or the subject is faced with temporal stasis followed by eventual death. And the most widely used diagnostic manuals do not refer to causal origins or the role of social and cultural context in gene expression or later communicative difficulties. A mysterious yet fixed and essential autism is apparent in Sydney Smith's writing about early autistic autobiographies in a collection of essays with Julia Watson on the everyday uses of storytelling. And referring to the first autobiography by Polly Samuel, aka Donna Williams, Smith concludes, "The silence that displaces everyday storytelling disrupts the everyday activities through which people engage in the building of families and communities. And in this lack of speaking, as well as emotional bonding, lies so much of the profound pain and suffering experienced in real lives around them." Smith connects this to what she perceives as a lack of an autobiographical subject. And this is produced by the lack of everyday practice of narration. And this idea she seems to have gained from reading the psychologist Bernard Rimland, who was one of the early proponents of the developmental model of autism. So the silence that she perceived through reading these autobiographical accounts was not simply the absence of everyday narration, but a disruption in normal activities around the individual. This might have been somewhat diminished if she had paid attention to the online autistic community that was developing at the time. And since Temple Grandin published Emergence, labelled autistic in 1986, and Polly Samuel's book became a bestseller, hundreds of other life texts have been published by autistic authors and collectives. Yet the idea that the narrators are still out of kilter with readers' expectations seems to be continuing, and it's produced by the application of an a priori assumption about what the text should include. An assumed absence of everyday narration also appears to justification for treating the text as though it is independent of a real life context. And while the diagnostic criteria have expanded since the time Smith was writing to include a wider range of manifestations of the condition, readers have remained curious about just how disabled or different the author is in comparison to their pre-existing ideas. So the focus on symptoms manifest in style in many of the early readings undermines the narrator's efforts to tell a story of progression. Francesca Happe wrote about Temple Grandin's first co-authored book that there are accounts of friendships and imaginative games which are surprising coming from an autistic child. These stand as a challenge to current theories of autism, which see a social handicap and the lack of pretense as the key features of the disorder. But they are sadly undermined by the presence of a second non-autistic author. Well, another option would be to consider whether the current theories of autism might need considering. For Smith and Happe, it would be easier to doubt that we are in fact confronted with real accounts of real lives. And while Happe has focused on the text's inadvertent signalling of autistic deficits, according to a cognitivist paradigm, Smith's reading is influenced by deconstruction's focus on the way the subject of the text is rendered through discourse. Through the absence of any non-clinical framing, she suggests that the autistic subject can only be present as either cured or excessive to cultural conventions. And while at the time of reading, we may agree that there was a lack of a non-pathologizing framework of language and scripts to interpret the text, it requires a further premise for it to imply what Smith concludes that it does, which is that the autistic subject themselves lacks an experiential self, which is exactly what Happe concluded in her reading of Grandin's text. It also requires that we assume the author lacks awareness of their own experiences so as to form an a priori narrative self that can provide an identity. Both Happe and Smith ascribe agency and creativity to autism rather than to the implied author of the text. So it would seem that the only possible narrative for the autistic narrator at that time would be to mourn the life that was not lived. And this is something that Alison Kafer has noted of the reception of disability writing in general. In what follows, I argue that these reading practices themselves create barriers to being for those who try to narrate their experiences of atypical embodiment. Reading practices inspired by cognitive psychology have produced an essentially static subject who is outside of material time and becoming. Further, we see that within cognitivist readings in psychology and life writing, normative time distinguishes natural and non-pathological subjects from those that are perceived as a burden to our collective becoming. The disability theorist Carol Thomas has identified two types of disableism, which are socially constructed barriers to doing imposed by society on those with impairments, and barriers to being that influence the emotional well-being of those who are considered impaired. For autism, bullying and discriminatory attitudes are often described by autistic individuals, but seldom taken into account in therapeutic interventions for mental well-being. While autistics find themselves out of place and unable to conform to behavioural expectations, they do not simply disappear, but must find some way of enduring. Writing itself may be understood as produced by this urge to record the present as I was here, and also to record hopes about the future. Recognising the agency and creativity of such accounts may help autistic and neurodivergent authors to overcome barriers to doing at the level of representation, and also allow for the emergence of new self-concepts. So returning to the two texts I just mentioned at the beginning, my first, I'll go back to consider Mukhopadhyay's work, Plankton Dreams. And although the events described occur in the past, like all good satire, Mukhopadhyay's focus is on the present and the attitudes he hopes will change. And I quote, "When the world outgrows an approach, however noble the sentiments from which it sprung, it should be changed. Think of it this way, every right has a left. Even right approaches can be viewed from the left. And autism, my friends, well, that most certainly offers a leftward perspective." The text isn't so much an episodic narrative as one that is iterative, and the experiences are mapped alongside the days of the week, which have little relationship to calendar dates. They're noted mainly for their influence on the teachers and students. In the final chapter, called simply Tuesday, the narrator considers the meaning of the word Tuesday in the context of special education. While he is supposed to be working on another worksheet on the subject of baby animals or fruit, he develops an alternative calendar system for the special education world, in which he could become Tuesday's champion by adding 6 extra Tuesdays to each week. He says, "I could promote Tuesday awareness. I could establish Tuesday Acceptance Month. I could insert these days into the calendar so that the planet could become aware of an alternative sense of time's progression." Mukhopadhyay shows that iterative events are deeply unsettling to both linear time, which is the progression of the student through their individual learning plan, and cyclical time, the progress of the working week towards the teacher's growing impatience. While much of this memoir is concerned with these dissident pleasures, and they also include things like sniffing or touching other people's heads and writing stories, these activities become more pleasurable as they are repeated and developed. Mukhopadhyay records his own plankton dreams as well, which haunt him long after he's left the school. He describes himself as algae, living a shadowy existence beneath the surface of the lake near his classroom, waiting to become fodder to a duck who captures him simply because he cannot control his movements. And I quote, "As everyone has a place by being a virtue of being a form of matter, I have a designated seat in the world of special education. That world is like a ship forever at anchor. In the special domain of special beings, where all is shadow, formless and wobbling, and hope itself lies sodden and submerged. The ducks, as social as fowl can be, dismiss their own reflections. Who needs illusory wings? Standing there watching the ripples on the surface of the lake, I learned the biggest lesson of all. Nothing will create substance out of shadows." Katherine May's book Wintering offers an alternate concept of time as governed by seasonal cycles and periods of preparing for change. While this may seem to relate to a sentimental domestic idea of time, May's concept of wintering is both personal and countercultural, where she connects cultural and ecological practices such as mourning and hibernation to the meaning of winter of a childhood left out in the cold through an undiagnosed autism. Reading wintering as a metaphor for depression, however, would miss the point that for May, these phenomena are produced by an interaction between the inner and outer worlds that is only known through subjective experience. While the text is organised around a single winter in the author's life, it also presents the non-linear sequence of analogies from human and more than human practices. Ranging out from the author's home, its imaginative world includes children's fables and natural history in search of metaphors that can guide a more sustainable relationship to time. The final chapter looks to entomology for ideas, but concludes that any analogies found there are ultimately unsatisfactory. And I quote, "The life of a social insect has nothing to say about us. Our lives take different shapes. We do not work in a linear progression through fixed roles like the honeybee. We are not consistently useful to the world at large. We talk about the complexity of the hive, but human societies are infinitely more complex, full of choices and mistakes, periods of glory and seasons of utter despair. Some of us make highly visible, elaborate contributions to the whole. Some of us are part of the ticking mechanisms of the world, the incremental wealth of small gestures. All of it matters. All of it weaves the wider fabric that binds us. The most helpless members of our families and communities are what stick us together. It's how we thrive." The present tense narration moves between the author's past and an imagined future to gesture towards a fabric that may support more marginalised lives. The proposed alternative framework for time counters the assumption that social time is always one of linear progress and development. Here, the endurance of earlier cultural practices attuned to changes in the weather becomes a source of potentially new relationships to time, in which pain and setbacks offer a firmer basis for solidarity. "To get better at wintering, we need to address our very notion of time," she says. "We tend to imagine that our lives are linear, but they are in fact cyclical. I would not, of course, seek to deny that we grow older, but while doing so, we pass through phases of good and ill health, of optimism and deep doubt, of freedom and constraint." May finally concludes that by denying the reality of the sources of suffering, including to those labelled autistic, we affect the kinds of people who can participate in everyday life and thus survive. "We put a brave face and grieve privately. We pretend not to see other people's pain. We treat each wintering as an embarrassing anomaly that should be hidden or ignored. This means that we've made a secret of an entirely ordinary process and thereby given those who endure it a pariah status, forcing them to drop out of everyday life in order to conceal their failure." So, to conclude my talk, I want to talk about the consequences of discourses that create social pariahs out of those who commit temporal misdemeanours. And to do so, I want to talk a little bit about ideas from science studies. The medical sociologist Greg Hollin has considered how within psychology, autism has until recently been characterised by both uncertainty at the level of ontology and at the level of epistemology. Hollin explored how since the 1980s, when the most influential autism researchers in the UK sought to find a single cognitive module responsible for autism, they invested in a supposed theory of mind module deficit. Theory of mind, also known as mentalizing, is a contested ability to register and track the mental states of other people. For those who adhere to this position, it is the core deficit present in autism, and it produces the difficulties in interaction and social communication that are listed in the diagnostic criteria. So While the usefulness of the term autism, even as its diagnostic criteria have changed, may be shown by those such as Katherine May, who have received an adult diagnosis and who have sufficient social capital to reject some of the more pathological associations, it's provided a helpful framework to describe some of her life experiences. Yet even in these cases, receiving a diagnosis can be problematic when it leads to discourses that produce a subject who is who's seen as being pathologically outside of normative time. My reading of the two texts suggests that the authors reinterpret their recollected experiences within an alternative framework. They suggest that atypical perception in information processing, rather than theory of mind difficulties, produce the behaviour that is consistent with what is currently thought of as autism. And I've suggested that their work provides material for new discourse structures that may allow for the emergence of new forms of sociality and temporality. For Hollin, autism research is characterised by a situation in which diagnostic apparatuses and the pathological condition they purport to identify are so tightly bound up that a new stable object of scientific investigation emerges. Framing this productively in terms of Karen Barad's proposed agential cut, Hollin has read the work of autism from the CDU at the University of London as based on discourses of uncertainty designed to make research doable. This produced a heterogeneous autism, which meant a condition that could manifest differentially either within groups of people or even within autistic individuals, while other explanatory possibilities existed. Hold on a sec. However, the cost of placing the agential cut in autism discourse meant that any creativity or agency would be seen to belong to the condition of autism rather than to the subjects themselves. And this has the effect, and this can be related back to Elizabeth Freeman's work on time, which shows that discourse structures have effects on bodies. Bodies are not only mediated by signs, but they come to matter through kinetic and sensory forms of normativity, modes of belonging that make themselves felt as a barely acknowledged relief to those who fit in, while the experience of not fitting in often feels both like having the wrong body and like living in a different time zone. So just to finish my talk, and thank you for bearing with me with the technical hitches, I wanted to leave you with a quote from Tito Mukhopadhyay, which I think summarizes some of the points I've been trying to make. He says, "I had to concentrate. The classroom metamorphosed into an idle field. There were some bored eyes evincing a little too much attitude, which might have interested Charles Darwin. Had they evolved beyond their primordial state, beyond, that is, their official diagnoses? What would he think about autism? Was our species as a whole continuing to evolve from monkey to human and human back to autistic subhuman? How does evolution work on planet special education?"
Thank you, Anna. It is a very interesting talk, and I think we could talk for hours about the three writers you proposed. But I first will give the floor to Anneleen Mascheleen for a response. Anneleen Mascheleen is a professor in literary and cultural studies at the University of Leuven, and she teaches literary theory, introduction to cultural studies, cultural semiotics, gender theory and literature, cultural policy, dance, film, and so on. And she also supervised my PhD, which was a project on contemporary writing culture and autism and self-writing. Anneleen will have to leave us after her response because she has an important meeting on COVID and education at the university. So, but I'm very glad she could be with us for the first response.
Okay, thank you, Leni, and thank you everyone for inviting me and for allowing me to experience this talk. And thank you very much, Anna. It was really interesting. Yeah, it's hard to think of a response on the spot. What I very much like in your talk is your the way in which you link different forms of temporality to this kind of decolonizing, or this kind of depathologizing, in a sense, neurodiversity. And yeah, I think that this is what interests me most, because there is, on the one hand, and I think the end quote about how does evolution work on planet special education is very telling in this respect. The idea that there are certain forms of subjectivity that can be expressed in a narrative form that is traditionally as much related to the idea of linearity and of teleology, that sort of resists this whole chrono-normativity, that we always have to evolve, and that things have to get better, and that we have to arrive at a kind of either a normalization or a solution, so that there are subjectivities that resist this. On the other hand, you often emphasized the importance of repetition and also different experiences of repetition. This is something that I would like to hear a little bit more about, this resisting of linearity and a kind of stasis. On the other hand, the insistence of iterativity, of repetition, that you find so much in these narratives. So I'm very curious to hear more about these two temporalities. There might be more. And a second question, and this is maybe a more formed question, because it comes from the work that I have done with Leni in the past, which has to do with framing. Of course, these are autobiographical narratives, but they are very often, they are already framed as being narratives of autistic subjects. I'm not asking you but why is this necessary? I think, why do we need this kind of hedging? Why do we need this kind of framing, this kind of diagnostic positioning to receive this type of accounts of subjective formation? Maybe we can already start with this and see where it takes us. Yeah, if you want to, I can make it more clear. It's just a lot of ideas, and I'm trying to...
Really helpful questions. Would it be helpful for me to respond to that now, or would it be...
No, I think it's nice if we can start a dialogue, because my ideas are not so clearly...
Yeah, no, I mean,
yeah.
I think you made some really good points, and perhaps there is, I think I need to clarify in terms of the difference between an iterative and a more repetitive timeline. I guess what I meant in a way was that what may seem like repetitive behavior may actually be a kind of iterative behavior that's actually finding new things within what may seem to be the same. It reminds me, there's a literary critic called James McGrath who's written a book called Naming Adult Autism, and he's an autistic literary scholar, and he talks about his own experience of going to cafes, the same cafe every day before he starts work. And he says how, to an outsider, this might look like, exactly what they're talking about, the repetitive, the ritualistic behavior. But he says every time he goes, it's completely different. So from his own experience, the light's always different. There are always different people there. And it's more that that provides the meaning, because it's a cycle that leads to quite different consequences and feelings for him. And I think that's similar in the narratives, because I think Katherine May's preparing for wintering. She wouldn't expect to do exactly the same thing each time it happens, but would learn something new that might make it easier, less painful to go through those experiences sometimes. So it would work for both pleasurable things and maybe less pleasurable things. I also think that question about framing is really important, and it's one discussion I have with my supervisor, is that actually what I'm talking about doesn't necessarily need to be within a narrative that's explicitly named as an autism autobiography. And neither of the two texts I've looked at are labeled as a book about autism. And I think that's maybe is different from Temple Grandin or Donna Williams's texts, which are the sort of they are autism memoirs or autobiographies, which is the great word Lenny came up with. When I think in a way this is a story of a life that doesn't necessarily need to be framed in quite that same way. So it's a life with autism, and autism provides a framework maybe to try and share understandings with the reader. And I think that's about as far as I've got with that. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yes, yeah, I think the two are not necessarily related, but I also worked a lot on the work of performance artists, and especially female performance artists who throughout their lives keep on recording their daily practice. And what I find very interesting in this type of work, and also in autism or autobiographies, is the fact is that the eventfulness or the meaning does not arise so much in the fact that this is about art or about autism, but through this careful recording and through this sort of iteration, as you say, subjectivity arises as a kind of tissue and not as a label. And I think that this is a very interesting thing that can be learned from diverse practices. And it's true that there is a temporality that arises, but it's a temporality that arises through this careful attention to the meandering or the different shapes and colors and textures of time. And I think that this for me is very interesting, and I'm not so much interested in the label myself. On the other hand, when Leni and I were working on the work of Donna Williams, and when I read a lot of these autobiographies coming from a very different perspective, it struck me that the label enforced so much interpretations on me that I did not find in the text, not knowing everything that was attached to the label, or knowing it much less, or being from a further distance connected to it. So, and it's true that it is about all these very small iterative, which can even be in a very small level, like on the level of a sentence or on the level of playing with a word. And you also notice it, I think, here in some of the quotes that you gave from the books. You also notice the iteration there, like the wobbling, the repetitions of sounds and so yeah.
I mean, that's that corresponds to, I mean, my background was as an environmental literary critic, and I've kind of moved more into disability studies and life writing studies, and it's certainly true that for a lot of the I did some work on walking artists in the UK, so that especially women walking artists, where walking is a performance, and that same kind of attention to materiality and repetition, but in a kind of iterative way, is definitely present. So that's probably influenced why I'm interested in that. And in terms of, I think and I wonder whether I've become so interested in the practices of reading and how we read the text, and why maybe some of these things are missed by other reading practices, by bringing too much to our own preconceived understandings about autism. And I'm sure that can work just as much for somebody who feels that they know about autism through their own experiences as for somebody with a particular psychological theory about autism. So I'm working at the moment, I've got a research assistant, and we're both reading some of the same works and looking to see which themes and structures of meaning we find, which is then we're going to discuss with a group of community participants who are not people who will have had access to the kind of cultural range or the kind of the high literary kind of world and the sort of things that we look for. So I think I've become really interested in those practices of reading, which is I think really important to finding these more kind of small, like smaller narratives about everyday life. So yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I don't know if there's anything else I could explain.
Yeah, I'm trying to, I would like to say that I'm looking at Leni to see how much time we have, but I don't see Leni, so I don't know, Leni?
You still have 5 minutes if you want, but yeah, otherwise I can.
Yeah, I think that obviously, and I think this is a question. I mean, both as literary scholars and also probably as readers coming from other disciplines, trying to read these narratives and trying to get something out of it. Yeah, the big question is, I think for me, is like, how are experiences filtered and how do they come? And so one filter is, of course, the narrative. The other filters are the frames. And then there are, then there are the cognitive frames that you have in your mind, the knowledge that is already there and that sort of shapes your reading. So how do you work in your own project to unravel all these different layers if you work with a broader community of readers? Can you say a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite helpful. I've started with a kind of me working with the text and a much less complicated kind of interaction and looking in a kind of chronological way. So I started with the earlier texts and then look at how they might speak to each other. But I've become interested in the idea of the dialogical self, the way in which we make interpret ourselves through the exchanges we have with others. So, for instance, in Donna Williams and Temple Grandin's work, I'm looking at the conversations they kind of have with the other narrators, the other characters in the book, about what autism might mean, and also the way they suggest different possible interpretations of their experiences without necessarily suggesting that it's one that's static. So they may, for instance, Donna Williams kind of tries to go back to how she saw her life before she had the diagnosis. So she tries to kind of fictionalizes that in the sense of, you know, obviously going beyond what she can actually recollect. And I find that kind of this sort of, I find the idea that there is a kind of self-story which we can only really remember the most recent version we have of our life experiences. But terms like autism can completely change how we then look back at some of our own experiences. And I've been quite interested in having conversations with psychologists who are doing work on kind of narrative interventions for therapeutic reasons. You know, how can it be once you have a more positive self-identity through an idea like neurodiversity, is it actually can it be quite traumatizing to try to go back to remember what it felt like when you felt that there was no language to describe your experience? That's something that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see how this research unfolds. And
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, everyone, I have to leave, but I will look forward to following this discussion later. And when I watch the recording, I wish you all a very, very good and productive further session. And thank you again for letting me be part of this.
Thanks, Emily.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Amelie. Then I would like to introduce our second respondent, Günter Martens. He's professor of German literature at Ghent University. His research interests comprise encyclopedic literature, narratology, and digital humanities. He's honorary president of the European Narratology Network, and more recently he also teaches literary disability studies. As of December 2020, he also supervised the research project Exquisite Defects, detoxing the female literary genius at the crossroads of critical disability studies and neurophenomenology. So, Günter, I'm very glad you're here with us.
Okay, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the opportunity to join in on this discussion. Anna, thank you very much for your talk. There's a lot to process, but I would like to pin it down to two questions. One relates to your final slide. So I completely agree with your critique of the imperialist and colonial legacy in psychology, especially when talking about time. Our notion of unified time is to blame on the emergence of the railway system, as we know, during the Industrial Revolution. And if this sorry lockdown situation has brought one single advantage, it is certainly that more people experience what it feels like to have one sense of time unseated, to sense that our synchronization is tied to shared space and a lot of normativity. However, speaking from my background as morphing into a neuronarratologist, I take a somewhat different stance towards psychology. I think psychological studies of the neurological and neurocognitive underpinnings of what we are discussing can continue to be helpful to some extent if we read them against the grain. So I'll try to give an example by referring to Stanislas de Haan. So he provides a description of things like dyslexia, sensory processing differences, learning differences, and ultimately also provides a link to evolutionary psychology. So the most recent version of his research comes to the conclusion that resistance against lateralization in the brain used to be a cognitive advantage, a matter of life and death in prehistory. And similar things are happening with regard to ADHD. So where research shows that mind wandering is actually the default state of the brain, and then through processes of enculturation yields a lot of differences in the ways it is enacted by people. So to simplify, I think there are some benefits to this view as well, that it could also be used for critical disability studies to show that the things that in other contexts these days, currently, like schooling systems, what is seen as a deficiency is actually a normal, quite normal and highly prevalent state that leads to different results. Would you agree that there is something to be gained from continuing to use this medical terminology?
Yeah, actually, absolutely. I think thank you very much. There's definitely some reading for me to do there, I think, and it's a body of work that I need to look at. I think I'm interested in engaging with psychology to kind of improve the practice rather than to dismiss it. So I guess part of being in a field of medical humanities maybe is saying that I think the name autism has helped people. I think it is about changing the idea that there's one central way of relating to time that's useful, rather than saying, and looking at the context and how it might work, rather than saying that that all normative or all kind of normal practices are bad. It's looking at the imposition of a single idea as being the only way to do things, which is the kind of maybe the colonial type impulse. I don't know if that's necessarily answering what you're saying, but I think it sounds like I really need to look at some of the writers you've mentioned.
Well, I know there's a risk in drawing back on to the feral element of it, which is of course not very helpful. And I do, in the corpus that I'm studying, find a lot of the non-Western concepts of identity that you mentioned. And so the contextual sense of self, often with references to mysticism, mythology. But to some extent, I have the experience that they develop their therapeutic value if read in tandem with the psychological understanding of things, and not just as wild speculations as to how different one could be. But that might be a reflection of the more literary corpus that I'm studying.
Yeah, I mean, there's a particular danger, I think, of assuming that maybe autism is like a kind of a wild state, or a state of being somehow less developed, and certainly, or being closer to nature. And certainly in some of the cultural representations of autism in Britain, it's sometimes seen that, particularly for people who are interested in non-human nature, we have very famous wildlife broadcaster, Chris Packham, who's is almost seen as a kind of savantism, that we can kind of interpret nature in some kind of primordial way. which I think is problematic. And I think that's where you need the medical perspectives to kind of intervene. And it's not kind of looking at a mystical way of being or a kind of something more authentically human. I think that can also be really problematic as well. I don't know if that makes sense in the context of what you've read.
Yes, thank you. It's very helpful. And then a second question, which is more a matter of self-doubt than actually a question for you, but maybe you can help me. So we're doing this project on literary authors that have not been diagnosed because they predate the knowledge of the medical conditions that then only after the Second World War gained up speed. But they have, in their own time, they have been perceived, so they're all female writers, as troublemakers. So they, their mental health has been called into question on a very public scale in newspapers. They have been declared mad. They have, to some extent, also been institutionalized. Only in more recent years, they have been canonized and rediscovered as actually very experimental authors, you know, the drill. But together with Lieselot van der Gucht, who is also in the audience, we're currently attempting to redescribe them as neurodivergent, because we have this idea that this terminology is actually more neutral towards understanding their writing than the heavily pathologized language that has been used and applied to them so far. But this is, of course, an ethical question. So we have encountered the reaction, can you do this? So it is to some extent anachronism, because their experience, their own experience of what they wrote cannot be attached to the labels and conditions that we use or are able to use today. And to what extent are we outing people that do not want to be outed? So you chose 3 authors that self-identify. Is this important for you? Is this a limit that cannot be transgressed? Or what's your view on?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and I've approached a similar question because I've been interested in a poet for a while who predates the autism diagnosis, but clearly shows some of this, you know, what we would now call autistic traits. And I think it's important, at least in theory, to say that autism has existed for a lot longer than the medical framing. But the way I got around this, and I think the idea of neurodivergence might be another way to do it, and I can't think of any reason why not. The author I looked at is an early 20th century poet who talks a lot about the idea of superfluousness or superfluity in other characters in the historical period, and connects it to the discourse about the creation of categories of socially inefficient people in the UK, which relates to the creation of the welfare state. And it was a term that I thought was interesting because he used the term and he considered himself superfluous. That was the word he used. And obviously there's a long literary tradition, well, certainly to the 19th century, of the idea of the superfluous man, which he seems to have got from Russian literature, or from the English translations. Anyway, it was a way that I've confronted a similar problem, because I wrote a talk about him as the superfluous man, though he was never diagnosed with autism, but his problems clearly went beyond depression, which is what he did. He had treatment for neurasthenia. I felt that it was important to use the word that he would use, partly because I think that our experiences are structured by the language that we use. I think it's a really tricky question, but I also think it's really important that we try to find the historical sort of ancestors for what we're talking about in the present. Neurodivergent is a much more neutral term as I see it. I think you can say it's a cultural phenomena rather than a medical one. but that needs to be maybe made quite clear, because I think often it is kind of connected too much to the categories that we have now.
Yes.
And also to the idea of including people in the economic realm, which I think I think it's an idea that needs critiquing further, which is what I'm trying to do in some other work. I'd love to talk to you more about that. Your work sounds really interesting.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up neurasthenia, because that's the way we're dealing with this ethical question at the moment. So we attach ourselves to the things that circulated also in their biographies. So there are mentions of neurasthenia, epilepsy, other speech
and was there a connection? Was there a category in German history of the kind of social inefficient? Was that something that was part of popular social discourses? Because in the UK, there was a movement to reduce, to try and prevent people reproducing who were considered socially inefficient. They had their benefits. They weren't entitled to the same benefits. They were kind of mocked and parodied. Obviously, it was particularly around men. And so I guess there would be a different framing for neurasthenic women. So I think it's a really interesting area.
Especially in the German context, one has to tread carefully with regard to eugenic background of popular understandings of this. But thank you very much. It's a very interesting project. And of course, I will now read the texts that you mentioned.
Good.
Thank you, Günther and Anna. And as you see, I'm alone now, and my son finally is confident enough to join his babysitter. I want to introduce our third respondent before we go to an open Q&A. This is Lisanna Melon. She studied literary theory or contemporary literature at the University of Utrecht and recently joined our U Antwerp team within neuroepigenetics. She performs a PhD project on mental health and games. She uses methodologies from disability studies, literary theory, and empirical philosophy to investigate what we can learn from video games regarding the experience of a diagnosis, especially autism, psychosis, and depression. And she's also especially interested in a neurodiverse perspective on video games.
Yes, so thank you, Leni, and thank you, Anna, for the talk. I really enjoyed the way you talk about autistic time. I think crib time and also autistic time is such an interesting concept. So I was happy to learn more about that. I have formulated 2 points that I would like to ask you something about. So the first one touches upon what Anne-Leen also mentioned about diagnostic positioning and the way that we approach these autobiographies in our research. And also because I see a connection between autobiographies and maybe the way that I approach video games in my projects. So that's why I'm interested in it. And you had a quote in the beginning of your presentation from Martin, I don't remember their first name, about the suggestion that psychologists expand their toolbox to include life writing. And this reminded me a little bit about the instrumentalization of literature, maybe. So how we use it as an instrument to learn more about a specific condition. And I think this is maybe not always something good. It reminded me a bit of symptomatic reading, so an immediate move to looking at the diagnosis itself. Yeah, and I see this with video games as well. If they are made by designers with a specific diagnosis, we immediately look at their diagnosis instead of maybe the creative strategies that they use to talk about this. And I think these aspects always interact with each other, so it's important to look at both of them. Yeah, so it's important to see these autobiographies maybe also as art itself. And of course, you also touched upon this in your talk. You mentioned how agency and creativity is often seen as belonging to autism instead of to the person itself. And I think that you, in your analysis, you also mentioned this, but I was wondering if maybe you would like to say a little bit more about this and about how you approach this. So that's my first question. So maybe you can answer this first, and then we can move to the second point.
Okay. Oh, that sounds like a very, yeah, very interesting, very helpful questions. I might have to ask you to remind me of the second part of the question. I think you're right that I guess this part of what I was saying does risk an instrumentalization of the literature, because in a way, I'm trying to speak at the same time to psychologists in what they might learn about autistic subjectivity from reading and life writing in a practical way that would be designed to help inform practical interventions, partly because I have this, I think it would be a good thing. I am also interested in how people might read the literature as literature, and that very much relates to my learning about narrative theory, rhetorical narrative theory in particular, which is something I've not really come across in the UK. We don't tend to look at rhetorical narratology as part of a kind of English curriculum, but I found it really helpful as looking at the kind of the mechanics of how you might, when you go through reading or a slow reading, you might look to the experiences of being unsettled or having things defamiliarized is part of the pleasure of reading, which isn't, it's not so much instrumental, but is something that's lost if you bring to the text too many pre-assumptions from what you think autism means. So I guess I'm trying to maybe advise literary life writing theorists about how to appreciate the reading without where autism isn't irrelevant, but it shouldn't be the only constraint, the only idea that they bring to it, in the way that they wouldn't for any other reading. It would be bad faith to assume that you knew more about the person's life than the author of the text. But I can imagine that would be similar with games, that you'd face similar issues. I've been looking at, I'm interested in the technological interventions, so robotic devices designed to help autistic children socialize, and thinking about how that would be, how that could be problematic for similar reasons, because it would maybe take out the way that other people might seek to interact with robotics for fun or pleasure or meaning making, rather than as just ameliorating deficits. So does that answer all of your question, or was there something, did I miss something?
No, I think that answers it pretty much. It's interesting how you raised the point about technology and how it is approached, because that's really also what I see in my work, that people immediately move to connecting neurodivergence with instrumental and practical approaches, maybe to enhance their life, and it's never about play and about enjoying it. Yeah, so that's really interesting to me. So maybe I can move on to my second point now, which is actually about eco-fiction and nature writing, because I know you're also interested in this. And I thought of this because you discussed Katherine May and wintering, and I was thinking the connection she makes between the way she experiences time and her metaphors about nature. I think this might not be so arbitrary. And it reminded me also about the connection maybe between autistic time and crib time more general, and for example, deep time, how it is used in eco-criticism. So yeah, different conceptions of time, how they feature in nature. And for example, it reminded me about this novel, The Overstory by Richard Bowers. I think you might have read it. And about how they discuss the difference between a human time frame, which would be about 100 years, and a tree time frame of about 300 years. And I always found this very interesting, but I always thought, yeah, but this still keeps up this dichotomy between a human time frame and a nature time frame. And I think this idea of autistic time and crib time as cyclical versus linear already opens this up a bit, because it does more with it than just mention that a human time frame is shorter. Yeah, so I found this very interesting, the way you talked about this, and I think it foregrounds alternative ways of experiencing time, maybe, that we could also use in eco-criticism. And then what I would like you to comment on, maybe, because I think you've also written elsewhere about this, is maybe the risk, if we do this, the risk of portraying autistics as closer to nature, maybe, and how to avoid this, of course, if it's a problem at all. Yeah, so long comment, but I'm wondering what your response is.
No, that's thank you for asking me about that, because the kind of eco-critical part of my work is something that I've kind of put on hold because it's quite tricky, I think. And I kind of wanted to deal with the idea of autistic representation more first, but I think in a way maybe Gunther's comments have helped to answer that, in that perhaps what the alternative ways of perceiving time aren't essentially autistic, but they are maybe part of undervalued ways that humans have experienced time that have become that actually are far more common than we realize. But the autistic narrator, maybe because of being left out of some mainstream social or ways of organizing time, has had more recognition for those experiences and their value to their lives. I don't know if that necessarily is problematic, but I'm always trying to avoid essentializing or saying there is one autistic way of experiencing time. And I think that's why I think that's something that I need to think about more. But I know that there are, at the moment, there seems to be a kind of boom in people looking at autistic representation in the UK. So there's people doing PhDs now on autism and environmental experience. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing their work on that, looking at life writing and also fiction. There's a kind of boom as well in young adult speculative fiction, which has some really interesting work on kind of alternative space times and looking at kind of interspecies encounter, but outside of the kind of earthly context, which are really interesting. Looking at kind of neurodiversity in a much broader sense of what does it mean to encounter other kinds of intelligence, which take that question of what time might mean into a kind of different framework entirely. So I don't think I've answered your question, but
yeah, it might also be a bit of a chaotic question to answer in a straight manner. But thank you for this for your response. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I think also that maybe framing it as neurodivergent ways of experiencing time is maybe better if you relate it to eco-criticism than autistic ways of experiencing time. Yeah,
I think that could be forward.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for your questions. That's great.
Thank you, Lisanna and Anna. Then I would like to open the floor to the audience. If anyone has a question, you can either type it to me or raise your hand and ask Anna your question. I see you are putting something in the chat, but if you want, you can also simultaneously read it out loud. Yeah, thank you.
I uncloaked, so I'm a Star Trek fan, so I show myself. Thank you for the talk. It was really inspiring. I like the word, as I said, I wrote it out. I like the word chrono-normativity. I didn't hear about it before. Maybe that's my loss, but anyway, now it's thanks to you, my gain. So I have two questions on that. One is, you've referred in your talk to maybe how I would frame it, to examples of chrono-normativity on a micro scale, like repetitive movements or cyclical behavior. But would you also see this applicable to more the scale, lifetime scale, like where it is assumed that you're young, you get educated, then you work, and then you go into retirement, and then you live happily and long, and so on and so forth? Would you also see the idea of chrononormativity that you explained applying at that scale or not?
Yeah, I absolutely would like to think it through at the bigger scale. I haven't had a chance to really do it yet. I think it is part of this, again, it kind of relates to my environmental interest in the way in which our ideas about what lives a good life have got these milestones that are actually maybe influenced by the material culture in which we have lived, but that is changing, and how maybe our ideas of a good life defined by these kind of unique, big, exceptional experiences might be unsustainable. I'm actually looking forward to thinking this through a bit more. I'm going to a conference next week on time. It's called The Material Life of Time, and Karen Barad is one of the speakers. And I think it's going to be, I know there's going to be quite a lot of environmental theorists there. I'm going to try thinking through some of this a bit more, but I have really focused on the more everyday things, because I think lockdown has possibly made me think more about those kind of everyday repetitions and kind of encounters we have more, where everything's been placed on hold, I think, for a lot of people. And thinking that we're, you know, the good stuff we were going to do, like traveling somewhere, it's had to be put on hold. And then we think, well, actually, should I be doing that stuff still? You know, is that still a good life? You know, local adventures can be really good. But I think there's stuff to be done on education as well. But I think Tito's memoir isn't so much about that he doesn't think he should have had an education, but that it should have been more appropriate for him and his circumstances. And that one universal kind of education doesn't work for people like him. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I haven't come.
No, it would be, no, I mean, it would be interesting if we meet each other again, or with the inspiration of your, but I'm a 52-year-old PhD student, and sometimes that sounds endearing to people, but if I apply for a job, whether it is academically or non-academically, I had a non-academic life before I had an academic life, what is seen to be kind of quaint or endearing soon becomes something like, what has happened with this person? Why is he following this track and not another track? So what seems sometimes as a benefit in practical life becomes a drawback, just because I don't follow apparently the typical time. So it would be interesting to see if you come across that again, whether you think that would be applicable, and whether people could be really kind of, in a norm of having to live their sequence of life in a certain way, which doesn't allow them to kind of express themselves. If I have time, Leni, I'll ask my second question. So you've talked about, let's say, liberal kind of conceptions of society driving towards individualism, and clearly you want to liberate us, also as autistics. I also have a diagnosis from this view of being atoms in space, or something like that, self-absorbed atoms in space. But and I agree with that, but my question is, doesn't some level of relationality or non-individualism, doesn't it require some kind of synchronizing on a common norm? Maybe not the norm of having to start from 9 to 5, but at least kind of syncing up between two people or between one person and their environment in a way of, let's say, being synced up, but being in the same time, so to speak? And how do you see, let's say, the responsibilities for both parts to actually try to come to some kind of synced time? That's for me, because there is always the question of who is responsible for what. If you want to bridge the gap, well, there are two people who can try to take steps there. So I was wondering how you thought about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. It's really nice to have some like quite philosophical. I mean, I'm not a philosopher, so I apologize for my lack of philosophical kind of perspective. But I think the idea, I think, is not that I against the idea of the individuals in the sense that, in a way, what I'm asking for is people to be able to narrate themselves, create a narrative identity that is more helpful for them as individuals, but that in a sense we're also relational. Part of that being is relational. And I think there's an idea of, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but symbiosis, of the idea of collectively making and becoming, which has come from, Donna Haraway talks about that, as the things that we create with others of from as a kind of relational care, an ethics of care. I think that's something that isn't kind of allowed for in the kind of current structure of individualism, that is about individuals kind of interacting almost from a distance, or in through a very kind of highly kind of very normative way. I think that's probably as much as I can say about that, but I think you're absolutely right. The idea of that we should all be that it has to be a practical way of coordinating what we do, and with responsibilities, not, you know, regardless of whether we're neurodivergent, that we are not, yeah, that it has to be a kind of shared context as well.
Thank you. Thank you for engaging with my question.
I hope you get a chance to talk more. I also did my PhD later on as well. I know some of the challenges of that, and it can bring a really interesting perspective as well to university life, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Great. Are there any other questions? We'll still wait a few moments. Okay, then I think if no one wants to ask Anna some other question, we can close this afternoon. I want to thank you all for attending, of course, and many thanks all for our speaker, for Anna, and our respondents, making this so an interesting afternoon. You can hang around still, but I will stop the recording. And you can also follow these these interdisciplinary lectures on our YouTube channel of Neuroepigenetics. Bye.